Simone de Beauvoir stands alongside Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus as a sort of trinity of French existentialist writers that most people will encounter in their dealings with modern 20th century existential philosophy after Martin Heidegger. Influenced by philosophers like St. Augustine, Hegel, Marx, and of course the aforementioned Heidegger, the French existentialists took their intellectual forebears and turned them in new directions. Simone de Beauvoir achieved precisely that in her feminist turn in the 1950s and 60s, when writing The Second Sex and The Woman Destroyed. In the introduction to The Second Sex, Beauvoir is asking the Hegelian question, does the authentic woman actually exist? It is a Hegelian question because, as we shall see, it is loaded with Hegelian phenomenological and dialectical presumptions. Can authentic woman exist in itself? Or is woman dependent on the other? Is her reality and nature as a woman dependent upon the gaze of those outside of her? Is woman understood in relationality to men or even perhaps other women? Or can a woman be isolated and understood authentically as the thing itself, as an individual? What kind of world and its ready-made values does woman find herself in? The world and the values established by men, or world and values established by women? If consciousness, as Hegel suggested, is dependent on dialectic, on another, then woman has a problem with regards to the fact that she is understood principally in relationality to the other, more specifically to man. In the introduction, which is a masterful essay in of itself, she establishes the framework and the grounding for the rest of her magisterial 700-page text. In fact, the introduction to The Second Sex is the most important contribution to feminist and existential philosophy in the entire artifice and construction of Simone de Beauvoir. Thus, these questions, this question of authenticity as it relates to women, is the backdrop to Beauvoir's great text of so-called second-wave feminism, which would influence people like Shulamith Firestone and her work, The Dialectic of Sex, which was, as we know, dedicated to Beauvoir. For Beauvoir, woman exists in the world of ready-made values and structures established and created by men. In her introduction, Beauvoir is asking the question of whether the authentic woman exists and how we would even know what the authentic woman looks like, given the reality that women find themselves in a world and in a world of values established by men. To define oneself as a woman, I am a woman, implies a sort of dialectical contrast. Definitions are always made in dialectical opposite to the other. This is one of the hallmarks of Hegelian philosophy. Here, Beauvoir shows off her reading of Hegel and the problem that Hegelian phenomenology and consciousness poses specifically to women. In defining herself as the woman, woman is the negative correspondence to man. Man is the metaphysical given, the starting point. Woman is not. This is borne out in ancient theologies, theogonies, and mythologies. Adam, man, was created first, and Eve, woman, second. Hence the title of Beauvoir's great book, The Second Sex. Mesopotamian creation myths saw the god-man warrior Marduk slay and defeat the woman chaos monster Tiamat, from which life and order came about in the world. Older creation myths see the male gods as rational and inseminating through a position of dominance over their female counterparts. As such, since man is the metaphysical given, woman is the great other, the negative antithesis to man. Man is the subject consciousness, while woman is the objectified other. Man has constructed the view where woman is juxtaposed to man at all times. Thus, to define oneself as a woman is to play the game that men have rigged from the start. Does this sound familiar to those of us living in the 21st century? A woman's notion of self, femininity, and womanhood are all the inherited negative contrasts to that of man. Humanity is male, and male defines woman not in herself, but in relation to himself. Beauvoir most famously writes, "Man is the subject. Man is the absolute. Woman is the other." For Beauvoir, woman is not defined as a minority. Woman's understanding and defining and definitional place in the world is defined by power itself, primarily male power, the patriarchy. In this respect, women are like the proletariat, she says, in the Marxist understanding of history and power relations. This is how Beauvoir and other feminists influenced by Marxism were able to smuggle and recontextualize Marxism within the feminist philosophical imperative. Because, if you know Marx, the proletariat is defined in opposition to the capitalist, who is the power class. Woman is defined in opposition to the male, and the male is the power class, or the power sex in feminist philosophy. In being defined as the opposite other of man, women have been slaves or vassals to men who have defined them and their position from their privileged positions of power. This is the necessity of the Hegelian dialectic at work. But for Beauvoir, there is no movement to a synthesis, no movement to some sort of equality. We are forever locked in the thesis, man, versus antithesis, woman, dynamic and power struggle, which has created the current condition of the subjected, objectified, and enslaved woman. In being defined as the opposite of man, woman's condition is that she is made into a separate caste of person, socioeconomically, has low power and low prestige in society. They're not the leaders of society, they are not the leaders of business, etc., and has a low history and non-existent or very minimal tradition to give her sustenance and provide meaning in her life. For instance, especially when Beauvoir was writing in the 1950s and the 1960s, there weren't many female great role models to look up to. Those were all men. Following Heidegger's conception of thrownness, woman is essentially understood as having been thrown or born into the harsh world of male domination, patriarchy, and othering, and expected to survive in this brutal environ created and established for the benefit of men. And in order to survive, one must subject themselves to male power and male structures. In examining the structures of society, Beauvoir reaches the conclusion that many of us today are probably familiar with, in part because Beauvoir was the matriarch of popularizing these views for the rest of second-wave feminism, which followed after the 1960s. Philosophy, law, religion, and economic systems were all constructed by men and therefore reflect and engender a patriarchal worldview, according to Beauvoir. These views, when accepted, especially by women, come at the expense of women and perpetuate the power dynamic and the privileged position of men and their worldview in society, which was established to benefit them and only them. Even science, Beauvoir suggests, is a male patriarchal system and structure used from a position of power which is to the sole benefit of men. Separate but equal is a sophistic power play, according to Beauvoir. Equal implies equality. Separate ensures male domination. Separate but equal, therefore, ensures male domination despite the promise of equality. As she explains, all the sciences, biology, psychology, physiology, are all the tools for othering, and men, being the leaders in science, use them to other women, because science is in the business of separation and classification and not equality. Thus, the oppressor-oppressed dynamic gives a greater sense of importance or superiority to the oppressor over the non-oppressor, the oppressed. The characteristics and definitions of the authentic woman has been defined by men to the detriment of woman herself. For instance, the idea that the authentic woman is to be the stay-at-home wife of a man whom she is married to is the definition established by men, and not the understanding of the authentic woman defined and created by women. By embracing this authentic womanhood, which was first established by men, women are embracing and perpetuating the male patriarchy. Thus, toward the end of the introduction, she asks the question, yet again, the most important question any woman can ask. How should women identify? And from this question and answer, how does being woman affect one's life? To this end, Beauvoir is actually quite hopeful. The ecstatic and chaotic nature of the dialectic, which defines her philosophy, especially in moments of crisis and explosion, have granted women greater and greater consciousness of their reality to their exploitation and oppression. The Industrial Revolution, the westward march over the prairies, for instance in the US, and the 2 world wars that Beauvoir had just witnessed and lived through, thrust women into the positions that men had traditionally occupied for over 2 millennia. Women could do what men can do just as well, if not even better, than men. The growing consciousness of women from these dialectical upheavals showed that women could be co-creators, or even the sole creators of the world and of the world's values, rather than submitting to the objectified subject-other status that men had given women. Thus, the new consciousness of women posits 3 positions for women to take. Woman is the equal to man. Woman is inferior to man, which is the current understanding. Or woman is superior to man. At the present moment, woman is trapped in the hierarchy of interests and systems established by men, which perpetuate the feeling and consciousness and understanding, as mentioned, that woman is inferior to man. Any reduction of freedom to facticity is an absolute evil, according to Beauvoir. Here, of course, is some Augustinian influence on her, that by accepting definitional facticity and othering women is deprived of the good, and a privation of the good is that which is evil, according to Augustine, and that is also what is evil, according to Beauvoir. However, Beauvoir does not blame man for the objectification of women and the evil that follows from their privation of subject consciousness. Beauvoir actually blames women for this. The fault lies not in the system per se, or those perpetuating the objectification and oppression of women. The fault actually lies with the consenting subjects who accept their objectification and reduction to facticity through the magical idea of consent. Beauvoir is actually trying to rally women here to shun their own subjectification to male power and bring them to a revolutionary consciousness, because they can choose to create a world for themselves. Women can choose to create the values in which to live by, and that is the call to revolution, liberation, and freedom. Woman's true essence is, therefore, the same as man. She is a free subject being of consciousness, capable of free and creative actions and choices in accord with her own will. Woman can and shall discover herself and choose to live in a world of her own choosing, not a world constructed and offered to her by men, which, when accepted or consented to, actually enslaves her. Thus, Beauvoir sees the future of women as either consenting to her objectified othering or fighting for her own liberation, to become the sovereign of her own consciousness and decision-making, the creator of her own world and her own values to live by. Following Hegel and Heidegger, Beauvoir does see the dialectic as essential to the world and to feminist philosophy. Woman is a being with, in the famous terminology of Heidegger. It is ultimately up to woman to choose the companionship that will accompany her in the world. Women can choose the companionship of the ready-made world of male patriarchy and thus remain enslaved to it, or she can construct the world of her own choosing, create a companion of her own liking, and in doing so, this realizes her own freedom and sovereignty as a result, because it is the freedom and sovereignty to choose for oneself, to create for oneself, and to establish values in which to live by for oneself, which is the true essence of all humanity, the essence that men have so far only reserved for themselves, an essence that is every bit the birthright of women as it is men. What is the authentic woman for Beauvoir? It is not found in definitions or characteristics or scientific biology. The authentic woman is the woman who, on her own accord, empowers herself and chooses to live and make a world of her own choosing, out of her own will, as all men do. But what can we take away, then, from Beauvoir's infamous introduction? The question of the authentic woman is generally a dead end, and one that embraces the reduction of women to bare facticity and is, as a result, an absolute evil, a privation of woman's essential nature as a creator. Women's primary understanding of herself is as the negated other to man, thus locking woman into a negative correspondent relationship to man, which perpetuates man's power dynamic over women. However, the advancement of consciousness is showing the weakness of the male-dominated world of ready-made values and systems that women find themselves in. Therefore, for women to be truly free and authentic, they must break free of bare facticity. They must break free of the scientific and biological constrictions placed on them by men. They must recognize that their essence is in the freedom of creation, the ability to choose for themselves how to live, the ability to choose the values and create the values for themselves and how to live, to choose to create a new world, a new system of values, a new morality in which they can live by. For that is the true essence of universal humanity that men and women both belong to.